Ick! Ah! Well, I got ick in this tank. Is it really as bad as the internet makes it out to be? In this video, I'm going to cover everything you need to know about ick. What is it? How bad is it? And how to get rid of it. What up, fish friends? If you're new to this channel, my name is Michael. I own an aquarium cleaning company based out of northern Colorado, and I've worked at a few different fish stores over the years. Needless to say, I've dealt with ick many, many times. So let's get into what it is. Ick is a protozoan parasite. Now, it sounds pretty fancy, but basically all that means is it's a single-celled organism and it's a parasite. And even though it's one cell, it is just big enough to see. And technically, in order to identify it with 100% accuracy, you'd need to have a tissue sample and stick it under a microscope. But for the most part, if you see a fish in your tank that's covered in fine, like powdered sugar coating, then that's probably ick. And it's not always necessarily going to be just like a complete coating. It could just be one or two little dots on the fish. So what ick does is it burrows itself under the fish's outermost cells and mucous membrane, but just barely under that. And so when it's there, it's eating off of the fish's like skin cells and gill and mucous membrane, but it has the benefit of being protected from medications by the fish's mucus and epithelial cells, the outermost cells of the fish. If they end up in the gills, then they make it hard for a fish to breathe, and that's kind of why you'll see your fish almost panting when they got too much ick in their gills. In order to treat ick, we need to catch it at exactly the right time, and that ties into the life cycle. So let's talk about the life cycle of ick. Well, unlike humans, who are basically born as smaller versions of our adult selves that just gradually grow into that, ick has different life cycle stages, kind of like a caterpillar eventually turns into a butterfly, and even though they're the same animal, they look completely different. Ick has actually 3 different life cycle stages. The first stage I already talked about, it's when the ick has penetrated the fish's outermost membrane and it's kind of embedded in there. It's protected by the mucus and epithelial cells, and it's feeding off of the fish's life source, basically. At this point, we refer to this life cycle stage as a trophont. When the trophont becomes mature, it leaves the fish's body and it forms a cyst, like this protective membrane around it. And at this stage, it's also immune to medication. It's called a tomont at this point, and to make things even worse, not only is it immune to medication, but it can reproduce like crazy. Now, it reproduces asexually, meaning you don't need to have a mommy and daddy, you just got one. It divides in half, and then it divides in half again, and then in half again. And so within one day, one ick can become hundreds or even up to 1,000 different individual ick organisms, which is really bad news for our fish. The last stage of ick's life cycle is when they're released from this cyst. They're called theronts, and that's when they are susceptible to medication. They swim around the tank or get pushed around the tank, and they're looking to infect a new host body so they can restart the cycle and keep reproducing like crazy. So the duration of this life cycle is completely dependent on water temperature. If your temperature is like, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, around there, a little higher, then the life cycle can wrap up anywhere between 3 and 6 days. If you keep cooler water, like 70 degrees and under, it can even take up to 3 weeks to complete this life cycle of ick. So when I read about ick online, it's pretty much always described as like, the worst thing that your fish can get, and it's going to wipe everything out immediately. And that is entirely possible, but it's also possible to not go down that poorly. So in this tank, I have some Venezuelan high fin cories that have ick, And they've had it twice. Both times they got it when I stuck them into a different tank. I think they're far more susceptible than the other species. I have some concolor cories in here that don't have any signs of ick. I have some Danios and Rasporas. They don't have ick. My bristlenose pleco doesn't have ick. So there's definitely some element of susceptibility. Certain species are more prone to getting it than others. The first time these guys had ick, it kind of resolved itself quickly. But this time around, they've had it for quite some time, a few weeks now. And I used Kick Ick to get rid of it, and that did not work, which is one of the reasons we're going on a few weeks. So even though ick in this tank hasn't spread and completely killed off everything, it hasn't killed anyone, I have seen it go completely the opposite way. So I've worked at a few different stores over the years, and that's one situation where ick is particularly rampant when it gets into a tank. So you're getting a lot of fish coming in and out. It's a stressful situation for them. And they're also usually juvenile fish, really young fish, going through a lot of stressful changes. That's when they're the most susceptible, and it can absolutely wipe out an entire tank. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've heard many people tell me about it. Don't be fooled by my story, me telling you, or other people telling you, hey, it's not a big deal. In my tank, it didn't do anything, so you don't need to worry. You should definitely take all the precautions you can in order to prevent and stop ick from spreading like wildfire through your tank. Treating ick. All right, so let's talk about the real juice of this video. How do you treat ick? Well, you can only treat ick at that one life cycle stage that I told you about, that last third part where they're in the water column. They're not protected by the cyst or the fish membranes. There's 3 main active ingredients used in various medications to treat ick: copper sulfate, formalin, and methylene blue. Methylene blue is my favorite. There are some catches to each medication, so, before you go buy it, make sure you read the back of the bottle. Certain species are sensitive to it. Check out your fish and what they can handle. For example, shrimp and other inverts do not respond well to copper, so copper sulfate is not a good idea if you got a bunch of cherry shrimp or other stuff like that. So in this tank, what I'm using is ICX that uses methylene blue. I do that every 24 hours, or right before dosing, I'll do a 30% water change. So it is pretty stressful on this fish. They're getting dosed every day in 30% water changes until 3 or 4 days after I don't see any signs of the ick. So if you think about it, the first stage, you see ick on the fish. All right, once that's gone, there could be cysts in the soil, and those cysts could last for 2-3 days. So I'll do 3-4 days to make sure that those cysts and all free swimming ones are wiped out from the tank. And in order to make sure that the life cycle does wrap up quickly, I bump up the temperature to 82 degrees. Make sure your fish can handle that before you do it. If you have cool water species, they might not like it, which means you're going to have to medicate even longer. And then the last real helpful tip when you're trying to get rid of ick in your tank is when you're doing those water changes, get in here, siphon these layers out. If there are cysts down there, getting in there to siphon gunk and other areas where this kind of gelatinous or like sticky membrane is able to attach itself to things, then that's a great way to just get rid of it before even having to medicate it. Prevention. Now that you know what ick is and how to get rid of it, let's talk about making sure it doesn't hit your tank in the first place. The number one best thing you can do to keep ick out of your tanks is to quarantine your fish. If you have one little aquarium, maybe it's not worth setting up a hospital or quarantine tank. If you're like me and you got more tanks than you need, then it's a good idea to have a hospital quarantine tank. Put your fish in there for a month. That way you can be sure you're not going to introduce any bugs to your tank. Another thing is just general husbandry. Make sure you take good care of your fish. If your tank accumulates nitrates, then do the water changes. Make sure that you're adding in a similar temperature water as you already have in your tank. In the wild, fish are most susceptible to ick during transitional seasons like spring and fall, when the temperature is going up or down really quick. So Keep things consistent, and that'll help. Diet, making sure your fish get really good food and that they're healthy and vigorous. That's a great way to deter ick. And then the last thing is tank mates. If you have rowdy fish in with some really shy fish, then your shy fish are going to get stressed out, and that makes them more susceptible. So a lot of these steps are really simple and kind of obvious when you think about it, but just make sure to take care of your fish, quarantine them, you should be good. All right, that's all I got for ick. Thanks so much for watching today. If I missed something, you got a question, or you have a way that you like to get rid of ick, drop that in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If you learned something, hit that like and sub button. Till next time, see ya!